Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully my recorder has actually started, but welcome back once again to another great week of American History 2 online. Today, we're going to finally get into the real conservative backlash against the counter-revolution we talked about last week, and talk a little bit more about how modern American politics essentially began to take shape throughout the 1980s, largely due, as many of you might have guessed, to President Ronald Reagan. So, we'll go ahead and jump right into the thick of things, of course, with the key terms. We're going to define what exactly the Reagan Revolution was and what its goals were. We're going to identify something called the Christian right. We're going to look at the culture wars. We're going to look at supply-side economics, and we'll conclude looking at the infamous Iran-Contra scandal. Now, also, of course, before we really get into the thick of things, I want to make sure you are aware of your upcoming dates. Now, your third debate materials are, of course, due on November the 30th. That will be after Thanksgiving break is over. You all, of course, should know by tomorrow or by Monday at the very least, whether you're doing the alternate assignment or whether you'll be in the live debate. Excuse me, but either way, the materials are all going to be due at the same time. Your final essay outline is due on the same day at 5 p.m. The details can be found in the final essay prompt, which is also located in Moodle. Your next major assignment after that will be your fifth content quiz, which is due on December the 4th, of course, as always, at 5 p.m. Now, you should all have a pretty good idea of how this system works by now, but if any of you have any questions, still feel free to reach out to me, join office hours, send me an email, whatever you think is necessary. But in the meantime, we'll go ahead and jump, like I said, right into the thick of things. And the first thing I want to do is introduce you to Ronald Reagan's charisma. Now, we are going to talk about some of the positive and potential negative aspects of Ronald Reagan's presidency, but one thing you do need to be aware of is his charisma and his ability as a speaker, which, as you might imagine, is one of the major reasons he made such a large impact upon American history. He had a great attachment to the American people. To give you an idea of this, I want you to watch this video here I have linked, which is Ronald Reagan's address to the United States after the explosion of the USS Challenger. Keep in mind, this was a very traumatic event for many Americans because it was watched by many live on TV, and as you'll hear Reagan mention, was actually played live in many schools. It's how, like, for example, some of you who are a little bit older in this class might remember watching live footage of the planes hitting the Twin Towers. This would be a very similar situation for that generation. So, when you watch this video, again, just to give you a bit of idea of what Ronald Reagan was like, think about, based on this video alone, regardless of anything else you may know and hate or love about Reagan, would you support Reagan from this video? Why or why not? And to also look at one of the more effective aspects of Ronald Reagan's speaking, why can you spot any instances in here where this speech is not just a great morale booster to sort of help heal the nation after this event, but how is it also an effective propaganda speech? Reagan was very good at twisting every situation, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'll leave that up to you, of course. But to get it to somehow support the greatness of America and contrast us from the Soviet Union. How is he able to do that in this speech? So again, just keep an eye out for those couple of things. But in the meantime, to introduce Ronald Reagan and some of the impacts he had upon modern politics, we're going to look at the early alliance that formed between Ronald Reagan and the Christian right, which, as many of you know, is still an alliance that exists between conservative evangelicals and many conservative politicians to this day. Now, from the very beginning of his campaign, Ronald Reagan was strongly supported by a group of individuals who would eventually be known as the Christian right. This is essentially a new conservative branch of evangelical Christianity that was strictly allied with the Republican Party. Many people wouldn't notice this today, but before this, there was actually a wider variety of Christian support for Democrats and Republicans. Now the evangelical side, as many of you know, is of course more closely aligned with the Republican Party most of the time. This is essentially when that started. Few issues that we'll dig into more specifically in a second that the Republican Party had an issue with. First, they wanted to return to traditional family values, focus on having a nuclear family, heterosexual monogamy, and have more traditional gender roles. They also wanted to support prayer in schools and an end to legalized abortion. So essentially, these were the main cultural or social issues the Christian right wanted to see done in American politics. Now, Why do you think these value issues are so significant? Why did they pick those? Our first pause of the day. Yes, I am going to take a sip of water. Excuse me. But yes, very good. Students hopefully watching this at home. Like I said earlier, this is essentially a backlash against the values of the countercultural movement. So whereas the countercultural movement wanted to break away from the nuclear family and experiment in other types of relationships, wanted to have experiment with other types of religion and philosophy, and wanted to support female rights and legalized abortion, the Christian right wants to do the exact opposite, of course. So again, big backlash against the perceived failures or inadequacies of the countercultural movement. Now, one of the interesting impacts that historians claim this has had on American history is that it has led to what many call the culture wars. This is essentially a period which really continues to this day, in which a few hot-button issues have dominated political discussion. For example, if you did the stories from the front reading from last week, you read about a few of those hot-button issues, which I'm sure many of you can relate to, still hearing debated today. Now, for a more humorous way to introduce you to in a little bit more detail to the culture wars, what I'd like you to do is to watch this college humor video called "If the Other Party Wins." Now, to be very clear, it is a bit dated. For some of you who are a bit younger, you might not understand all the references. But to give you a bit of background, this is essentially a satire video that was made during the Obama and McCain presidential election of 2008. So back during Obama's first presidential campaign run. Now, as you watch this video, be able to identify some of the major hot button issues of the culture wars and think about how they're being handled today. And finally, try to identify one of the main problems of the culture wars, or what do you think the main problem is? Now, I'll give you just a moment, and then we'll go ahead and come back to that last question. So pause this video, follow this link right here. Alright, very good. I'm going to assume you went ahead and paused that video. So I'll leave it up to you to go over that reading I mentioned earlier and go through this video to identify some of these hot button issues I haven't already mentioned. But I think one thing you hopefully notice from watching this video is that one of the main problems historians and political scientists have identified about the culture wars is the idea that we are so divided on these social issues. Many times the parties tend to exaggerate what's going to happen if one or the other gains some power or passes some legislation. Which, of course, is not me trying to say you shouldn't be very passionate about politics. As always, as I've said before, your political opinions are totally up to you. But there is some demonization, many would argue, that is not entirely necessary, and it also has led to sort of very strict divides of political identity. If you have one political belief, you're assumed to support everything that political party supports, which of course you could argue could be a problem on both sides of the aisle. Once again, I'm not going to get into that at all. That's up to you. But it is just to show that with the rise of the Christian right and the culture wars, politics in America has become extremely divided over some social issues. But anyway, to jump more in specifically to the actual Reagan Revolution. The Reagan Revolution was essentially Reagan's policies to free America from the liberal policies of the New Deal, and again to get rid of the legacy of the Cultural Revolution. A couple of things he wanted to do. First, there's going to be a 25% tax cut for working Americans. Obviously still a part of many conservative political platforms today. They usually focus quite a bit on tax cuts. Increased military buildup to oppose the USSR, and supply-side economics. Now, are there any potential difficulties you might notice here, or anything that might be difficult about these policies to carry out? Very good. Any economists that I have watching this at home, many people, especially on the more liberal side of the aisle, might argue that having this tax cut, but also trying to increase military buildup and spending, is going to be a bit difficult to pull off. So that is, of course, one of the major criticisms opponents of Reagan were going to have about Reaganomics, as it was typically called. But the solution to this was this third option, or was this third goal: supply-side economics. Supply-side economics was essentially Reagan's main economic policy. He was going to solve the dilemma of whether the government should cut popular programs or whether it should cut taxes. Because again, very similar to the military buildup or the tax issue. During the New Deal, we talked about how liberal policies had become very popular in supporting work programs, Social Security, social safety nets, and things like that. So the idea was that Americans didn't really want you to cut any of those programs, but they also didn't really like having their taxes raised. So how exactly do you do that? So the idea was that with these tax cuts, it would stimulate new investment into the economy. This would in turn create more jobs, which would create revenue growth painlessly. So essentially the idea was that if the government gets out of the economy and leaves it alone and doesn't tax it, it will get healthy and grow itself and help raise the money that is needed to help all these social programs in the military without actually taxing people. Now, obviously, again, this is going to be a popular change with conservatives because conservatives are typically very anti-tax. That is still an issue today. Donald Trump, for example, talked many times throughout his presidency about passing various tax cuts. That is not a new desire from conservatives. Anyway, to get a little bit into detail about supply-side economic impact, I'll have some stuff for you to look into this a little bit more on your own, but this is what I have for you just in our limited time. Supply side of economics has had mixed immediate results, and its overall impact is still debated by historians and economists. So really no easy solution here. In 1981, Reagan did convince Congress to pass that 25% tax deduction. Taxes were actually significantly higher since the end of the New Deal up to this period. However, many historians and economists argue that this primarily benefited the wealthy due to the graduated income brackets. So they would be saving even more money than the lower class individuals did. Also, taxes went up due to Social Security increased payouts. As some of you know, one of the problems of Social Security right now is that since people are living longer and getting older, more and more people are having to be added onto the Social Security payout list. This began to be a problem as the wartime generation from World War II got older. The national debt also reached its highest level up to that point, largely due to Reagan's scientific and military spending. However, inflation did drop due to some of the lowering of taxes. This did lead to a certain extent further spending and investment in the economy. So, one thing I'd like you to think about for future assignments as well is whether or not you agree with supply-side economics. It is, of course, still a very popular plan among conservatives, but based on this, did it actually work? And do you think it could work? But anyway, in the meantime, let's get a little bit more detail into the Christian right. As I said, Reagan was extremely popular with conservative evangelicals because of his support of some of their various social ideas. One of the reasons they're so significant is, of course, they didn't just talk about liking Reagan. Many of these groups were also very prominent in raising money and putting together rallies for Reagan. Similar to some religious right organizations' relationship with Trump today, for example. For instance, some of you may be aware from Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham's support of Donald Trump and some of his various rallies. That sort of alliance began during the Reagan presidency. The Moral Majority was one of the most significant ones. It was founded by Baptist minister Jerry Falwell Sr. This group has some of the various platforms you are all probably familiar with. Again, there was that promotion of traditional family values, opposition to media outlets accused of promoting an anti-family agenda. So anything that promoted anything outside that nuclear family idea, you didn't like it. There was opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment and the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, opposition to state recognition or acceptance of homosexual acts, prohibition of abortion, and even more controversially, also this including in cases involving incest or rape. So many people would be willing to compromise and outlaw abortion in certain instances, but the Christian right, especially under the Moral Majority, went for even outlawing it in cases of incest or rape. Again, of course, being much more controversial. Finally, there was support for Christian prayer in schools. Again, many of the various conservative and religious right issues we still hear about today. Also, another significant one was the Christian Coalition, which was founded by former presidential candidate Pat Robertson. This group was primarily a voter mobilization group, which at its height established a mailing list of several million. So you know how, for example, I bet every single one of you watching this got a bunch of letters either from Trump and or Biden during this election cycle? This Christian coalition did the exact same thing, essentially trying to mobilize the religious voting bloc to support Ronald Reagan. Now, one thing I do also want to mention is one of the even more controversial aspects of the Christian right's involvement in politics, which is their role in dealing with the AIDS crisis. Now, one of the issues with the Christian right, and one of the things that made them unpopular with some at the time, is that they did oppose federal funding and research for AIDS due to its association with homosexual activity. As some of you may know, when AIDS first started becoming prominent in the 1980s, many people were convinced that it was only a disease connected to homosexuals, and homosexuality was to blame for it. For example, that Jerry Falwell I mentioned earlier, he said once that AIDS is not just God's punishment for homosexuals, it is God's punishment for the society that tolerates homosexuals. So again, the Christian right was often very opposed to AIDS research for this. They felt that it was interfering with God's will, essentially. One of our own senators, Jesse Helms, who was serving in the 1990s, once said, "The bottom line is that Greensboro, North Carolina, or rural Texas will never have an AIDS outbreak like San Francisco." Of course, implying that AIDS is going to be connected to San Francisco due to its status as essentially a center of gay culture. So again, very opposed to all these AIDS issues. Again, focusing on the nuclear family here, seeing it as a threat to traditional American families. However, by January of 2007, North Carolina had actually reached the top 10 in new confirmed AIDS cases. So again, very quickly, this, of course, idea that AIDS is only a disease associated with homosexuality was very quickly debunked. But throughout the 80s and some of the 1990s, this belief still held pretty strongly. But anyway, in the meantime, to get a little bit more into Reagan's foreign policy issues, again, he greatly increased military spending to combat the USSR in the Cold War. He essentially wanted to restore America's foreign reputation that many felt had declined due to the mishandling of Jimmy Carter. By 1983, Reagan had sent U.S. Marines to support Israel in the Lebanon Civil War. Like many conservative politicians and presidents to this day, Reagan was, of course, a very staunch supporter of Israel, as you might imagine. During this time, there was a suicide bomber that killed 241 Americans, which resulted in U.S. withdrawal from the area. Now, one thing I'd like to focus on for a second is wondering why this crisis didn't affect Reagan in the same way Jimmy Carter was affected by the hostage crisis. Awkward pause once again. But yes, part of that would, as you might have guessed, be again related to Reagan's charisma. He was very good at whipping up public support through his speeches, but also as a result of many responding positively to Reagan's backlash against the counterculture and encouraging more U.S. involvement in the Cold War. So even though this was essentially a colossal failure, many people were still on board because it seemed like Reagan was at least taking a strong stance against the Soviet Union. Also, from October the 25th in 1983 to December 15th, the United States and six national coalition group invaded Grenada to overthrow the leftist revolutionary government there. So again, under Reagan, the United States is getting heavily involved in overthrowing leftist governments across the world. This was justified due to the American medical students in danger in the country, according to the Reagan administration, and it did result in democratic elections by 1984. Now, to sort of wrap up the Reagan era a little bit, we'll go ahead and get into some of his downfall. First off, in 1984, Democrats were actually able to gain control of both houses of Congress. So they controlled the Senate and they controlled the House of Representatives. Why is that going to be such a problem? Thank you once again, audience at home, and bonus points for those of you who looked back to FDR as an example. If you remember, FDR was able to get quite a bit done in the New Deal when he had both houses of Congress on his side. However, when he didn't, he wasn't able to get nearly as much passed. Because remember, the way our government is supposed to work is that the legislators or Congress proposes the laws and the president will just approve them. So it was going to be much more difficult for Reagan to get the laws he wanted passed when he had a liberal Congress trying to propose the laws that he was going to have to see come across his desk. So this essentially limited what Reagan was able to accomplish in his second term. Also, by 1987, the stock market crashed once again, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average falling by about 22.6%, which is at the time the largest drop in one day in American history. Finally, what many thought would be the final nail in the coffin of the Reagan administration was the Iran-Contra scandal. In this scandal, the Reagan administration supported anti-communist Contra forces in Nicaragua, which, by the way, these communist forces were, of course, trying to take over Nicaragua, again showing the importance of the Cold War. And Reagan tried to help raise money to fight these groups by selling weapons to Iran in order to fund these rebel activities against the communist forces. Now, why would this particularly anger Americans at this time? Very good. Those of you who were paying attention earlier, if you remember from last week, due to our support of Israel in various Middle Eastern conflicts especially, we were not really having very close relations with Iran at the time. So many Americans were outraged that the Reagan administration would be working with essentially America's enemies. So, as a result of this, 14 administration members in the Reagan cabinet were indicted. 11 were ultimately convicted, but were of course later pardoned by George H.W. Bush. Now, fortunately for Reagan, he was found to have no knowledge of illegal activities, but of course his reputation still did suffer because it was many of his top-ranking advisors who were wrapped up in this controversy. But anyway, last thing I want us to look at before we wrap things up is, again, the legacy of Reagan. Barack Obama once said about Reagan, "I think Ronald Reagan changed the trajectory of America in a way that Richard Nixon did not, and in a way that Bill Clinton did not. He put us on a fundamentally different path because the country was ready for it." So again, how is Ronald Reagan's legacy still affecting American politics today? Did Ronald Reagan help sort of set up the political dichotomy that we're all familiar with at this point in time? But again, I'll largely leave that up for you to decide. Just again, remember your upcoming assignments, and let me know if you have any questions. Have a good day.